We're going to start talking about anatomy now. So far we talked about cells and we talked about chemistry and all that, but now in this chapter we actually start talking about the human body, and this is really where anatomy starts. So, yes, we're in our third week or whatever, but in a sense this is where the class starts. All right, so we last time, I know it was at the end, so I'm just going to cover this stuff again because you were probably all mostly checked out by then. But all of the tissue types in the body, there are four types, so all the tissues in the body are four kinds: epithelium, connective tissue, muscle, and nerve. And we're going to talk about each of those in turn in this chapter. Most of what we're going to learn about muscle and nerve, though, is going to come later. We're going to do muscle in Unit 2, and then we're going to do the nervous tissue in Unit 3, and we'll cover all of its complexity at that time. So we'll start out with epithelium, and this is really the chapter where we talk more about epithelium than anything else, because epithelium is so important. Okay, so epithelium is the tissue that covers surfaces of the body, and it also creates glands, because epithelium is very good at secretion, so it's good at making stuff. And in a little bit, we'll look at the different structures of glands. So an important characteristic of epithelium is it is avascular. In other words, it does not have arteries and veins running through it. Now, one of the reasons for that is epithelia tend to be quite thin. So in a way, there's not room for blood vessels to run through it. Now, epithelium, they're living cells, though, so they need to get their nutrients and oxygen, and they need to get rid of their carbon dioxide and waste products. So they do so by being close to blood vessels. So what we'll see is that epithelium is always associated with connective tissue underneath it, and it's in that connective tissue then that the blood vessels run, as we'll see later. All right. Epithelium regenerates. The cells in the body that reproduce the most, that divide the most, those are your epithelial cells. Particularly in regions where it's kind of a tough neighborhood. So like the skin is exposed to the environment all the time. And one of the ways that our skin maintains itself is by constantly replacing cells. We have that same thing that goes on in the GI tract. You can imagine that what's passing through the GI tract is pretty nasty, caustic stuff. So the way that our GI tract maintains its health is to constantly replace cells all the time so that the cells are new and vigorous so they can handle that hard environment. Epithelia is polar. Now this isn't the same kind of polar we talked about with molecules, but in a sense it means a little bit the same thing, and that is one side of the cell is different than the other. And typically we talk about an apical part and a basilar part. So all epithelium sits on a membrane called the basement membrane or the basilar membrane. And then the cells, kind of stick up on the top of it like this. So when we talk about the apical side, that's this side, and this is the basilar side. So basilar and apical. Now typically, and then under here would be connective tissue, which we'll talk about later. And then on this side, so this is either a lumen or a surface. Or surface.
IAL?
Huh?
APICAL?
A-P-I-C-A-L. Now let's try that again. A-P-I-C-A-L. There we go. Apical. So a lumen is just the inside of a thing. So if you were to take a pipe and cut it in half, the inside of the pipe is the lumen. Okay, so you've got the pipe wall and then you've got the lumen. So this may be a new term, but we're going to use that term a lot because like the GI tract has a lumen. It's a tube essentially, right? So the lumen is the inside of it. So like in the GI tract, if this is our pipe, the epithelial cells line the inside of this, and their apical surfaces point towards the lumen, or the center of it. All right. And we'll talk more about this polarity concept later, yes?
What's that word that's like the bottom?
Basilar.
Basilar?
See, this is what happens. I try to write fast. B-A-S-I-L-A-R. There you go. And please do point those out if you can't read my writing. I don't mind that at all. All right. So what does epithelium do? Well, First up, it provides physical protection. So, the easiest example of that is the skin. The skin provides physical protection against temperature, humidity, insects, bacteria. So it basically protects the inside of the body in a physical way. So mechanical, chemical, biologic agents. Epithelium controls permeability. So we saw that word permeability when we talked about the plasma membrane, right? The part of the cell that separates the inside from the outside. You can think of epithelium as doing that same thing for the whole body. So epithelium separates the inside of the body from the outside of the body. So it controls permeability. In other words, what comes in and what goes out. Every single thing that enters the body proper, in other words, not like the lumen of the GI tract, but muscles, bones, connective tissue, everything has to pass through an epithelium. So like when you eat a meal, those nutrients, in order to get into the bloodstream, are going to have to pass through an epithelium. And the reason for that is then that epithelium can control what comes in and what goes out. Because there are some things in that meal that we want to bring in, like the nutrients, but there are other things we don't want to bring in, like bacteria or like toxins, things like that. So the epithelium performs kind of the same function as the plasma membrane, but for the whole body. Sensation. A lot of epithelium has sensory nerve endings that run through it. Again, the easiest example is skin. We can feel things on our skin because that epithelium that makes up our skin has sensory nerves that run through it. And when we talk about the skin in the next chapter, we'll see some examples of that. And then secretion. Epithelial cells are the producers of the body. The sweat, mucus, hormones, all of those things are created by epithelial cells because they're very good producers. And then polarity we already talked about. So there's a basilar surface or a base, and then there's an apical surface. And all epithelial cells sit on a membrane called the basement membrane or the basilar membrane. And your book doesn't go out of its way to point that out, but it is an important characteristic of epithelium that it sits on this membrane, that it actually makes itself, as we'll talk about here in just a second. All right. So because there are lots of different kinds of epithelia in the body, we need a classification system to sort of categorize them so we can talk about them easier. And we classify epithelium by organization and by shape or arrangement. So simple means one layer. Stratified, that may be a new word. A strata is just a level or a layer. So a stratified epithelium has multiple layers. So, if you've looked at the rock wall in a canyon, for example, you see the lines, the layers. Those are called strata. And it's the same thing. So stratified means layers. And then the other way we organize epithelium is by shape. And here we're talking about shape of the individual cells. So we have squamous. Again, this is a new vocabulary word. Squamous means flat. Okay? So squamous cells are very, very thin and flat. So in our example here, you're looking at it from the side. And squamous cells are, in a sense, they're kind of disc-shaped. So if you think about a frisbee, it has a flat dimension and it has a broad dimension. And that's how squamous cells look. Another example is they're a little bit like paving stones because they kind of form this sort of hexagonal shape, but they're disc-like, very thin, flat cells. Cuboidal, that one's easy to understand. They're cube-shaped. So they're about the same height as they are wide. So in all three dimensions, they're about cube-shaped. And then columnar means column-shaped. So they're tall and thin. So you can imagine if you took a cuboidal cell and you made it taller in one dimension, now you've got a columnar cell. And we'll see examples of all these different epithelia as we go through the talk today. Okay. So, and then here at the bottom, we have, so this is just examples of stratification. So here we have a stratified squamous, because see these cells are kind of flat. Now, I agree they're not as flat as this example, but they still are flatter than they are tall. So this would be a squamous epithelium, a stratified squamous epithelium. Here we've got cuboidal cells, but there's more than one layer, so we would call this a stratified cuboidal. And then here we've got columnar cells. They're taller than they are wide, but here again we have more than one layer, so this would be a stratified columnar. And I think you'll get this a little bit easier as we start looking at some examples here later. But let's zoom in and look at how epithelial cells attach together. You know, if they create a membrane or they create a covering and nothing can get from here to here without passing through the epithelium, it means that these cells have to be attached together somehow. You know, otherwise they would pull apart, stuff would be able to get in between them, and they wouldn't be able to perform that function of physical protection and controlling permeability. So we have a number of cell-to-cell connections and then cell-to-basement membrane connections that we'll see throughout the course, not just this chapter, but next chapter, so we're going to introduce them now. Okay, so here's one cell. It's been kind of cut open so we can see inside, and then here's its neighbor cell, right? And the cells have to be connected together. So the first kind of connection is called an occluding junction. And here's one cell membrane, and then its neighboring cell membrane is here. The way I think of occluding junctions is they're sort of like stitches that you'd make with a sewing machine. You know, these proteins in the membrane bind together in such a way that it's almost like the cells have been stitched together. Now, the important role of the occluding junction is it prevents substances from going between the cells. So in any epithelium whose job it is to control permeability, they're going to have occluding junctions so that stuff can't sneak in between the cells and down through the basement membrane. So you can imagine if you had these all the way around a cell, there would be no way for substances to get from here down to here because it's all occluded. You know, occlusion just means blocked. So that's an occluding junction, kind of like a sewing stitch all the way around the cell. An adhesion belt, you know, adhesion is stickiness, right? So an adhesion belt helps to stick cells together. So the primary role there is to prevent cells from being pulled apart. And typically we find adhesion belts in the apical part of the cell, or the top part of the cell. And it helps keep that membrane from losing its shape, essentially. Okay. Now, this is a typo on the slide. I don't know if it's in your book, too, but this is not a JAP junction. This should be a gap junction, so change that J to a G. Is it in your book like that? Just out of curiosity. It says gap junction in the book. So a gap junction connects two cells. Okay, so here's a cell membrane, right? And then here's its neighboring cell membrane. Gap junctions are like straws, okay? They have a hole through the center. And the straw on one side connects to the straw on the other. So this membrane and this membrane connect together, but you see that it creates this space in between. So the role that a gap junction plays is it allows one cell to communicate with its neighbor by sending molecules through these channels, but from one cell directly to another. Now, typically in the body, you don't have this pattern. If a cell is going to communicate with another cell, it has to send something out into the interstitial fluid to affect the neighboring cell. But in epithelial cells and in smooth muscle cells and in cardiac muscle cells, we have these gap junctions that allow materials to flow from one cell directly to the neighbor without having to go into the extracellular space at all. So it allows ions to pass. And then the last one is the strongest of the adhesion molecules. So, you know, this is just a sampling of the kinds of cell-to-cell connections there are. The desmosome is like a super adhesion belt. In a sense, the desmosome is a little bit like a spot rivet. So if we have one cell membrane here, and we have another cell membrane here, what the desmosome does is it's going to attach these two cells very tightly together because there's a disk of protein just on the inside of the cell membrane on both sides, and then there's a kind of rod that goes in between. So you can imagine that if you were going to pull these two cells apart, this structure is going to prevent that, because we have this big broad surface here, and then this tough connection in between. You're not going to be able to pull those two cells apart. So desmosomes help to prevent cells from being pulled apart. So we see these in the skin, where physical forces and trauma would have a tendency to rip skin. Desmosomes keep the cells so tightly bound together that they can't be pulled apart. We also see desmosomes, again, in cardiac muscle to prevent the heart cells from being pulled apart as the heart contracts. So those are 4 different types of cell-to-cell connections. So occluding junction keeps things from going in between cells. Adhesion belt holds cells together. Gap junctions allow stuff to go from one cell to the other. And then desmosomes hold cells very strongly together. All right. And then at the basilar surface down here we go, is the basement membrane. And the basement membrane it's a complex, relatively flat membrane. It's actually produced by the epithelial cells and the connective tissue cells that are underneath them. And then the cells are firmly attached to it. So in the we have what's called a hemidesmosome, so it's sort of like a desmosome that attaches the cells down here to the basement membrane. So the basement membrane, or the basal lamina, it has 2 layers to it. It has a clear layer and a dense layer. Okay, the clear layer is not surprisingly clear, at least under the microscope. And then the dense layer is not clear. That's where all the strength of the basement membrane comes from. So we talked just a couple of different spots about the basement membrane. It's just important that you know it's there. The epithelial cells are not just sitting there. They're sort of sitting on a floor. So you can think of the basement membrane as the floor that the epithelial cells sit on, and they're attached to the floor. They're anchored to the floor so they can't be pulled off. All right. So that was just some general stuff about epithelium in general. Now we're going to look at some examples of these different types. So probably the simplest, and in some ways one of the most important in the body, is the simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so let's look at our organization. Simple means one layer. Squamous means flat. So a simple squamous epithelium is going to be one flat layer of really thin cells, which is exactly what we have here. So this is peritoneum. This is the covering of the organs of the digestive system on the outside. So they're outside covering, inside the abdomen, but outside of the organ, we'll have this peritoneum. And you can see how these cells look a little bit like paving stones. So they kind of interlock together. But then in cross-section, they're very, very thin. We'll see this same arrangement in the lungs, which allows oxygen to pass through and carbon dioxide to pass out. We see this same organization in the capillary walls. So anytime the body needs to make a very thin membrane, it's going to use a simple squamous model. It's going to use simple squamous epithelium because it just doesn't get any thinner than these squamous cells. All right. So the simple squamous epithelium. All right. Now, if we take squamous cells and we stack them on top of each other, we get a stratified squamous epithelium. Now, that the squamous cells in that simple model, they have a very simple shape. They're very, very flat. In other places of the body, squamous cells are not always that flat. And they can resemble cuboidal cells. But let me give you a little hint. Do you see any of these cells that look like squares? I mean, even these, like here's probably the closest one, and it's not a complete square, right? Cuboidal cells are very square. So if it's not very square, but it's kind of blobby like these, those are squamous cells. And you're going to get to look at all these in lab to get a little better at it. But so this is a stratified squamous epithelium. We find this inside the mouth, in the upper part of the esophagus. So we have a stack of squamous cells sitting on that basement membrane. Now, in the skin, we have stratified squamous epithelium, but it's keratinized. And what that means is covering the living cells down here is a layer of dead cells that are full of a very hard and dense protein called keratin. So the skin is a stratified squamous epithelium that has a keratin coat on top. So we call it a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And we'll talk more about keratin in the next chapter, but just like insects have a shell, and turtles have a shell, keratin creates our shell. Only our shell is very, very flexible and supple, so we can one-up the insects on that one. But it performs sort of the same function. It gives us physical protection, waterproofing. Our water stays inside of us because of that keratin coating on the top. But more on that later. All right. So here we have cuboidal cells all in one line, or all in one layer. So this is a simple cuboidal. We find these in glands and ducts. This is an example of the kidney tubule. And you will get to be able to tell squamous from cuboidal. I know when you first look at them, they're like, wait a minute, didn't you say that they were supposed to be really square? You'll get it, I promise. When we go in lab, you'll see the difference, and then you'll understand. All right. We can stack cuboidal cells into multiple layers. So here's a stratified cuboidal. This tissue type is pretty rare, though. We find these in the sweat glands, which you can imagine would be kind of hard to find under the microscope. But it's just giving you yet another example of how we name epithelium. There's more than one layer. They're cuboidal in shape, so it's a stratified cuboidal. All right. And then there are two special cases, which I put over here. This is transitional epithelium and pseudo-stratified, and we're going to talk about both of those. The first one is transitional. In a transitional epithelium, it can change from a stratified appearance to a simple appearance. So the easiest way is to describe what's happening here. The lining of the bladder, the bladder is kind of a smooth muscle sac that stretches out and gets big, and then it shrinks down and gets small. So when it's shrunk down and small like this, the cells are kind of stacked on each other. So it looks stratified, right? But as the bladder stretches out, this lining gets thinner and thinner because the same number of cells have to cover a larger space, if that makes sense. Just like a balloon, when you blow up a balloon, the wall of the balloon gets thinner and thinner and thinner, right? Because it's the same amount of balloon, you're just making it take up more space. Same thing is true for a transitional epithelium. As it stretches out, it gets flatter and flatter and flatter. So it can have a very strange shape in its relaxed state, and then as it stretches, it gets closer and closer to a simple instead of a stratified stratified appearance. So it can look either way. Is why we call it transitional. And we'll get back to the pseudo-stratified in a minute. Okay. Columnar epithelium is a very common lining of internal structures. So like the respiratory tract has a columnar lining. The GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, is columnar epithelium. And typically it's a simple columnar. In other words, it's one layer of tall, thin cells. Okay, so we see these in lots of different places. Now, in the GI tract, the top edge or the apical side of the epithelial cell has these little hairs. Now, they're not really hairs. They're extensions of the plasma membrane, but we call those microvilli. It expands the surface area at the top here. So under the microscope, we see this as kind of a red ridge. But you can see that we've got, here, I'm going to turn these off so you can see it a little bit better. So you have these tall, thin cells with their big nuclei in the middle. Okay, so simple columnar epithelium. And then we get into our second special case, the pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. Okay, let's break this word up. Pseudo means false, right? Stratified, we learned, meant in layers. So this is a false layering. And in the lining the respiratory tract is a simple columnar epithelium that has a stratified appearance under the microscope, even though it's not actually stratified. So like when you look here under the microscope, you see a line of nuclei here, and then another one, and another one, and another one. So at first glance, you might think, okay, this is stratified. You know, these are cells that are stacked on top of each other. But if you could see closely enough, what you'd see is that it's not like that. The nuclei are sort of look like they're in layers, but the cells themselves go all the way to the bottom. So in the pseudostratified, it's a columnar epithelium, and it's simple. In other words, every cell starts at the basal lamina and goes up to the top, but because of the arrangement of the nuclei, it looks stratified. So one way to spot this special case is by looking at the top here, because pseudostratified epithelium have this fuzz along the top, and those are cilia that are important for keeping the respiratory tract clean. These cilia, they actually beat like little tails, and they move mucus around all the time. So pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, great big long word, but this is what lines the respiratory tract. Pseudostratified because it looks layered even though it's not. Columnar because they're tall and thin. Ciliated because they have cilia at the top. And it's an epithelium because it's a lining. So even though that's a big long descriptor, that's the second special case for the epithelium. All right, so get your devices out and tell me what kind of epithelium this is. All right, I got to send you the question, so just a second. Oh, see, it's not me doing that. It's the system. Hold on. I sent you a true and false question instead of that. There we go. Okay. It should change. Might reload the page if it doesn't change. I don't want to put you to sleep, but I also want you to be able to see the picture. All right, it's okay. We'll go on to the next one here in a minute. Because I am getting some answers here. So another trick is if it gets stuck like that, if you log out and log back in. But okay, I'm going to go on anyway. Okay, so let's look at our picture here. Simple versus stratified. Okay, certainly we see layers here, and it doesn't look like that special case of pseudostratified because we don't see the cilia at the top, and we don't see cells that are sort of tall and skinny. So, okay, we know it's stratified, which in this case, that gives you your answer because that makes it would have to be B. But if we look at the cell shapes, you know, they're sort of, you know, flattened or, you know, like geometric shapes, which is what stratified squamous epithelium look like. So what we have here is a stratified squamous epithelium. We would find this in like the upper part of the esophagus, the mouth. All right. Okay, next question. What type of epithelium is this one? Now, who put E?
It was an accident. It was really.
All right, let's look at our picture here. You know, is it simple or stratified? Well, we pretty much see just one line of nuclei, right? We don't see, except maybe this one, but oftentimes you'll have one or two nuclei that'll sort of be out of whack. So probably simple, and all the cells look kind of tall and skinny. So this would be D, a simple columnar epithelium. And this would be taken from the GI tract because you can see the microvilli layer at the top, that band of red there. So that's another quick way to identify this particular tissue. Okay. One more. What type is this? Boom. Good for you all. I think that's everybody's answered. Let's see. All right, so this is one of the harder ones, but this is A. This is a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And there are some tricks for identifying it. It has a hairy surface at the top, different than that microvilli surface, right, that just makes a band under the microscope. Here, you can almost see what looks like little hairs sticking up. Pseudostratified because the nuclei are in layers, even though the cells are not. So this is a simple epithelium. In other words, it's just one layer. Columnar, so it's pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Oh, I guess we got one more. All right, what type of epithelium is this one? Hold on, it didn't end. Trying again. I'm going to actually end this one early because this is not a good picture. I would never give you one like this. This is actually a stratified columnar epithelium, but we didn't really look at an example of that, so just forget you ever saw that. All right. Okay. So in addition to covering surfaces, which is where we see epithelium play the biggest role, at least in A&P in this introductory course, we talk more about epithelium as a surface covering than anything else. But epithelial cells also create the glands of the body. And by definition, a gland is something that secretes something. So it's an organ that secretes something. There are two main kinds of glands. There are endocrine glands and exocrine glands. An endocrine gland is a gland that secretes something into the blood or into the tissues of the body. So it's an internal secretion. So the pancreas, for example, produces insulin, and that insulin is an endocrine secretion. That insulin gets secreted into the blood vessels and then moved around the body. The more common kind of gland is the exocrine gland. And this is a gland that secretes something onto a surface or into a lumen. So again, the pancreas is also an exocrine gland because it produces digestive enzymes that enter the lumen of the GI tract and a bicarbonate solution. The sweat glands are another example of exocrine. The mammary glands are another example of exocrine system or exocrine glands. And secretion can happen in three different ways. There's merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. And they're strange words, and we don't talk a lot about them, but just so you'll have heard the concept. In apocrine secretion, part of the cell itself is lost. Okay, so the cell gets bigger, it sheds part of itself, it regrows and sheds that part again. So essentially, it's breaking part of itself off all the time to release the secretion. In holocrine secretion, the cell is destroyed. So basically, a cell fills up with whatever's going to be secreted, and then it dies and opens up and releases all that secretion wherever it's going. So apocrine and holocrine are the more rare of the three. So an example of holocrine secretion, essentially this is what happens on the skin to produce that keratin coat. Is skin cells fill up with keratin and then they die, but that keratin stays behind as a secretion. The most common kind of secretion is miracrine secretion, and this is what we talked a little about when we talked about the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum in the last chapter. That stuff is made in there, and then vesicles move that stuff to the surface of the cell where they're released in exocytosis. Well, that's miracrine secretion. So most of the body's glands produce it in this way. You know, whatever is being made is produced in the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus, packaged into vesicles, and then released onto the surface. And this surface is either going to point towards the blood vessels in an endocrine gland or towards a surface in the exocrine gland. So apocrine, holocrine, and miracrine. All right. And there's a classification system for glands too, but think simple on this slide. Like, you can write that on there. Think simple. So there's basically two organizational systems that I care about you knowing. In a simple exocrine gland, the duct doesn't branch, and in a compound gland, it does. Okay, so even though there's all these different patterns, I'm only really interested in you knowing the difference between simple and complex glands. So you can see here's a duct, here's a duct. The duct, okay, so this is the duct, is the first part. This is the gland itself. This is why I don't have you learn this, because it's confusing. But the duct is what actually empties onto the surface. So here you can see that the duct itself branches, like here's a branch, here's a branch, here's a branch, where even in this one, this is the duct, but it doesn't branch. All right, so complex and simple. Move on past that. All right. Okay, so that's epithelium. So we have our organizational system, primarily lines or cover surfaces, important in lots of ways. We'll be talking quite a bit about epithelium. All right. The next kind of tissue, remember we had 4, epithelium, connective, muscle, nerve. Connective tissue is by far the most diverse group of tissues. There are lots of different kinds of connective tissues, and they're very different from one another. But for all that diversity, they do share this in common. So all connective tissues are made up of specialized cells, and those specialized cells produce protein fibers, so they produce extracellular material, and ground substance. Now, ground substance is just, it's produced by these specialized cells, and it's dissolved proteins, carbohydrates, and water. So basically, it's a kind of fluid substance that the extracellular proteins and these specialized cells are floating around in. So when we talk about the matrix of connective tissue, we're talking about the non-cellular part. So that's the extracellular protein fibers and the ground substance together make up the matrix. Now, the reason we have a special word for the non-cellular part of connective tissue is that one of the rules of connective tissue is there's a lot more stuff in that tissue than there are cells. When you look at an epithelium, it's all cells, right? One cell lined up right next to each other, or, in a big sheet. In connective tissue, most of the stuff that's there is not cells. It's stuff cells have made, but the cells themselves make up only a small part of all that's there in that connective tissue. So as an example, bone is a connective tissue. And most of what bone is not cells, it's stuff that cells have made. So collagen fibers, and the calcium-containing mineral that makes bones hard. So whenever you see a tissue that has a lot of stuff but not very many cells, it's going to be a connective tissue, because muscle and nerve all have lots of cells. Epithelium always has lots of cells, so connective tissue is the one that's different. All right. So connective tissue does all kinds of stuff. It provides the framework for the body. So this is the bones, adipose tissue. Basically, any time you're between epithelium, nerve, and muscle, you're in connective tissue. So it fills up the spaces in between the other 3 tissue types. Blood and lymph are fluid connective tissues, so connective tissue is responsible for transporting stuff around the body. It protects organs like adipose tissue. Fat tissue is not just for energy storage. It also acts as kind of padding for the delicate organs like the kidney. It supports, surrounds, and connects all the other types of tissue. Stores energy, particularly in the form of triglycerides, not the most popular part of connective tissue, but nonetheless, that's what it does. And then it defends the body from invading microorganisms. So, again, the blood and the lymph, being connective tissues, are responsible for that important part of the immune system, which you'll talk about next semester. All right. So you'll see in anatomy as a common theme. Whenever we have a thing that's complex, we divide it up so that we can talk about it in a more simple way. So connective tissue we divide into 3 categories, which you see over here. We have CT is just connective tissue. That's not computed tomography like you're used to, but CT is connective tissue. So connective tissue proper, it's called that because the classifications have changed. So in the old days, connective tissue was just that part. But we divide connective tissue proper then into, we classify it as loose or dense and regular or irregular, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But loose just means that there's a lot of space in between things. Dense, everything is very compact. So all connective tissue propers are either loose or dense. And the other 2 adjectives are regular and irregular. So in a regular connective tissue, there's an obvious pattern. All of the substance kind of follows the same pattern. And we'll see examples of that in a minute. Irregular is just the opposite. There's no obvious pattern to what you're looking at. So for every connective tissue proper, you're going to have 2 adjectives. So it might be loose, regular, or loose, irregular, or dense, regular, dense, irregular. Okay, so just like we had an organizational system for epithelium, for connective tissue proper we do too, and we'll talk more about those here in a minute or next time. The fluid connective tissue, that's blood and lymph. Both of those you'll talk much, much more about next semester. And then the structural connective tissue, we have cartilage and we have bone. Now, there's 2 different kinds of bone, and there's multiple different kinds of cartilages. But in the end, we call them structural or supporting connective tissues because that's what their primary role is to give the body structure or support. All right. So the most common kind of connective tissue in the body is areolar tissue. So when you look at this picture, you see lots of different things, right? First off, you don't see any particular pattern to anything. It's not like all the fibers are going in one direction, or we don't see a geometry or a regular pattern. So this would be an irregular connective tissue because it doesn't have that pattern. And then also, you see that there's a lot of space in between things. So that would make it a loose connective tissue. So this would be a loose, irregular connective tissue. And the areolar tissue is really the tissue that lies in between everything else. So where the body doesn't have something it's doing on purpose in that region, you're going to have areolar tissue. So this tissue is very flexible. It holds things together, but can still change its shape very regularly. And it has all kinds of stuff in it. So here, these long threads, these are protein fibers. This is things like collagen and elastin that help to attach, the different parts of the body together. We have some immune system cells here. We've got a plasma cell, a macrophage, a mast cell. All of these cells play a role in fighting off infection. Here we've got a couple of adipocytes. These are fat cells. Adipose tissue is made up of these, but areolar tissue has some of them in it too. And adipocytes really are, here's the cell right here, and it has this big glob of fat in it. And that's because an adipocyte is really there to store fat, either for protection or as an energy reserve. Lymphocytes, again, these are another component of the immune system. So what we see in areolar cells is all kinds of stuff. And things move around in here. You know, these immune system cells kind of wander around and come and go. And then another thing you see here, this is a blood vessel here, and this is a blood vessel here. Areolar tissue is often found underneath epithelial tissue. So remember we learned that the epithelium doesn't have blood vessels of its own. So it's the blood vessels in the areolar tissue that are going to supply the nutrients and get rid of the waste products for those the epithelium that stands above it. All right. So all different kinds of things in areolar tissue. A couple of other loose, irregular connective tissues. Adipose tissue is fat storage. In life, when you look at it, we would see these yellow globules. And when we get back into the cadaver lab and lab, you'll get to see that fat is very yellow. Human fat is very yellow. Under the microscope, though, that fat ends up disappearing because it comes out when the slide is processed and put together. So under the microscope, you get disappearance. You don't see the fat. Instead, you just see what's left behind. So you have kind of this very wispy, very delicate-looking structure of cell nuclei and walls and big empty spaces. So adipose tissue, which you'll get to see in lab. Reticular tissue it provides a 3D semi-flexible framework. So any organ that has a rigid anatomy, like the liver does, needs to have some way of holding that anatomy's shape. So reticular tissue sort of looks like this. We see quite a few cell membranes, but then we see a lot of fibers. Here's a fiber, fibers like this. And these fibers are what give the liver its shape and make it kind of hard and rubbery to the touch, as many of you found out when we looked at the cadaver last time. All right. So those are some loose connective tissues. In terms of dense connective tissues, here you can see the difference. Compared to areolar tissue, there is very little space in this, right? Everything's all sort of crammed together. Same here and same here. Now, regular versus irregular, when we look at this one, we can see that, all the fibers are kind of going in the same direction. They're following the same path. Even though there's bends, all of them bend in the same spot. So this very organized pattern, this would be a dense, regular connective tissue. Dense because there's not much space. Regular because all the fibers are sort of lined up together in a pattern. So like this is what tendon looks like. Dense, irregular tissue. Here we have a lot of density, not much space here, but there's no common pattern to the fibers. Everything's all sort of jumbled up. So this is a dense, irregular tissue like you'd find in the dermis, which we'll learn about in the next chapter. And here's another dense, regular connective tissue, elastic tissue. So not very much space, but all the fibers are lined up in the same direction, so it has a nice, even pattern. So a dense, regular. This is tissue that's very stretchy. Some ligaments in the body, particularly in the spine, are sort of elastic in nature. They can stretch and then snap back. So this is a tissue like that. All right. So let's stop there because it's time to stop. And we'll finish up next time. Oh, I didn't actually announce it. I'm moving the homework due date for Chapter 4 because we're not going to get done with it today. So instead of being due on Friday, it's going to be due on Monday instead. So I'll change the dates. All right, thank you, everyone.
So you kind of have that one would be loose irregular, right?
Huh?
That would be loose.
Yes, loose irregular. That's areolar tissue. Yeah.
Tissues.
You'll get it. And spending time in lab trains the mind to think. Yeah.